Climate change is this massive, complex challenge. And sometimes, honestly, it feels like we're just stuck in endless political gridlock when it comes to actually doing something about it. But what if there was an emerging solution that maybe surprisingly holds the potential to actually bridge those very divides?
Yeah.
I was looking at this new research, and that idea, it really jumped out at me.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. We're diving into a nationally representative study over 2,100 American voters. It just got published in PLOS Climate. And it gives us this unique lens, really, into how an emerging climate technology is perceived before it gets all tangled up in politics, which is pretty rare, actually.
Yeah. Right. So our mission today is to kind of extract the most important nuggets from this study. We want to help you understand not just what solar geoengineering is, but how maybe increasing public awareness about it might actually reduce that ideological polarization, the kind that's historically stalled climate action here in the U.S. So, yeah, get ready to unpack some surprising insights. Okay, so to kick us off then, for anyone who hasn't encountered it yet, what exactly is solar geoengineering, SG as they call it, and why is it even being considered, as an additional measure for global warming?
Sure. So solar geoengineering, or you might hear solar radiation management, SRM, it's basically an emerging technology concept. The idea is to cool the Earth's atmosphere. It works by reflecting more sunlight back into space, or maybe reducing thermal radiation leaving Earth. The goal is to try and partially counteract rising global temperatures. But, and this is really important, a recent report from the National Academy's NASEM, they recommend cautious U.S.-led research on SG, but very explicitly alongside robust emission reductions. So it's definitely not seen by scientists as a substitute for cutting emissions, more like a potential complement.
Okay, so a significant cutting-edge idea. But here's the crucial piece, I think. How familiar is the public actually with this? What did the study find there? Are we talking about something most people have just never really heard of?
Yeah, pretty much. The study found remarkably low public awareness, really low. A big chunk of American voters, 54%, said they'd heard nothing about solar geoengineering in the past year. So less than half had heard anything at all. And only a tiny fraction, just 7%, said they'd heard a lot.
Wow. 54% heard nothing. So given how few people have even heard of it, that raises a really fascinating question, doesn't it? When you're starting from almost a blank slate like that, how do people's existing political beliefs shape their initial views? And then, crucially, what happens as they maybe start to learn a bit more?
Exactly. That's the core of the research.
We know climate change itself, well, it's super polarized in the U.S., right? Conservatives often more skeptical, especially about government intervention policies, liberals generally more supportive. So how does something like solar geoengineering, this sort of new tech idea, fit into that whole deeply entrenched landscape?
Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, that political polarization, it's still a huge barrier to effective climate action, no doubt. And this divide, it often gets reinforced by what psychologists call motivated reasoning. That tendency we all have to interpret information in ways that just confirm what we already believe, our politics shaping how we see the facts. But SG might possibly uniquely transcend these divides. Why? Because it hasn't really been framed in partisan terms in the media yet. Not widely, anyway.
Okay. So unlike things like carbon taxes or regulations, SG hasn't become that kind of political football yet. How does its nature as a technological solution potentially play into this, especially with those existing political leanings?
Yeah, the study suggests exactly that its perceived nature as a technological fix rather than a regulatory one could make it more appealing perhaps to conservatives, especially those who tend to associate climate action with, intrusive regulations or limits on fossil fuels. Now, the research is clear this interpretation isn't quite aligned with the scientific consensus, which, as we said, sees SG as complementary to cutting emissions, not instead of. But still, that technological appeal, it might genuinely help foster some bipartisan engagement. It opens a different door.
Right, that makes sense. And this leads right into the study's central idea, doesn't it? That increased familiarity with SG might actually reduce ideological polarization. What were the two main sort of theoretical pathways the researchers proposed for how this might happen?
Okay, so two main ideas. First, they suggest that just getting more familiar with something complex and relatively unknown like SG, it might lead people to move beyond their default political reactions, their ideological priors, and maybe align more closely with the scientific understanding. Less gut reaction, more informed view. Second, as we just touched on, SG's appeal as technological, not regulatory, might particularly resonate with conservatives, and that could potentially shift their attitudes towards supporting some form of climate intervention which in turn would shrink those ideological gaps we usually see.
Okay, this is where the data really brings it home. What did the researchers actually find when they looked at the relationship between political ideology and attitudes towards SG? Specifically comparing people who were familiar with it versus those who weren't.
Right. They looked at three key things. First, beliefs about SG's effectiveness. Does it work? Second, concerns about its risks. Is it dangerous? And third, preferences for different climate strategies, like should we just cut emissions, just invest in SG, or do both?
Got it. Let's unpack the first one. Perceived effectiveness.
Yeah.
Did knowing about SG change how much people believed it could actually make a difference in mitigating climate change?
Yeah.
And crucially, how did this vary across the political spectrum? Was there a big shift?
Oh, yeah. The findings here were really quite striking, really interesting. Among the respondents who were unfamiliar with SG, there was this massive gap, like 55 percentage points. Only about 9% of extremely conservative folks thought it would make a difference, compared to 64% of extremely liberal respondents. Huge difference. But once people became familiar with SG, that gap shrank dramatically. By almost half. It dropped 23 percentage points down to a 32-point gap. Belief in effectiveness for extreme conservatives, it jumped up to 36%. For liberals, it stayed high, around 68%. So yeah, just knowing about it significantly closed that divide on whether it could work.
Wow, 23 percentage points closer just from familiarity. That's a huge shift in perception. Okay, what about concerns? Were people worried about researching SG? And how did familiarity influence those concerns across the political spectrum? Did that gap also shrink?
Yes, similar pattern with concerns, but with an interesting twist. Initially, among the unfamiliar group, extremely liberal respondents were actually more concerned than extremely conservative ones, about a 14 percentage point difference. But again, increased familiarity significantly narrowed this gap too. It dropped to just 6.6 percentage points. But how it narrowed is key. It mainly happened because concerns increased substantially among the extremely conservative respondents. Their concern level jumped from 47% among the unfamiliar to 68% among the familiar. For liberals, concern also went up, but less dramatically, from 62 to 75%. So it seems like being more informed leads to a more balanced recognition of SG's complex trade-offs, maybe, more awareness of potential downsides across the board.
That is a truly interesting convergence. So conservatives learning more didn't just make them like the idea more, it also made them more concerned about the risks, bringing their level of concern much closer to the liberals. Does that suggest maybe a more realistic shared understanding of the complexities involved?
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Exposure to more information appears to bring both sides closer to acknowledging the complexities. While liberals' concerns were already relatively high and stayed high, conservatives' concerns rose significantly to meet them more closely. It suggests familiarity doesn't just boost conservative support for the potential effectiveness, but also fosters a greater awareness of its nuances and potential risks, kind of leading to more common ground on the nature of the challenge itself, perhaps.
Fascinating. Okay, finally, what about the preferred climate strategies? Did familiarity shift opinions on where to invest? Mainly cutting emissions, mainly SG techniques, or trying to do both?
Right. So overall, looking at everyone, 38% preferred investing only in emissions reduction. Only 14% favored just SG techniques. And almost half, 48%, preferred doing both. That was the most popular single option overall. However, when you factor in familiarity, things change. Those familiar with SG, and this held regardless of ideology, were actually more likely to favor investing exclusively in SG compared to the unfamiliar respondents. And this effect was stronger for extremely conservative respondents, about a 13 percentage point increase favoring SG only. For extremely liberal respondents, the increase towards SG only was smaller, about 5.5 points. And maybe counterintuitively, both familiar liberals and familiar conservatives became less supportive of the both option, combining SG with emissions reduction.
That does raise an important question. Why would familiarity lead people away from the both option? That seems like it would be the sensible middle ground, right? Combine the approaches.
It's a great question, and the researchers do flag this. They acknowledge their survey gave three very clear, mutually exclusive choices, and maybe real-world opinions are a bit more nuanced than that, right? This shift away from both could reflect that once people learn more about SG, they develop stronger, maybe more defined preferences for specific policy solutions. It's possible that the unfamiliar folks just defaulted to both out of, say, uncertainty or wanting to cover all bases, whereas familiarity gives people a clearer sense of direction, even if that direction is towards SG alone for some. It doesn't necessarily mean a total rejection of combined strategies in practice, perhaps. For instance, some people might see SG as a way to facilitate a slower but still meaningful transition transition away from fossil fuels, a kind of middle path, that wasn't explicitly offered as a choice here.
Okay, I see. It's complex how people form these preferences. So let's try and pull this all together then. The core finding seems pretty clear. Familiarity with solar geoengineering is linked to reduced political polarization. Why do the researchers think this happens? What are the main drivers here? And what are the bigger implications for climate policy discussions?
Well, the findings point towards those two main reasons we discussed. First, as people learn more about something complex and relatively new like SG, they do seem to, perhaps, move beyond just partisan cues and lean more towards a science-informed view, or at least a more considered view. And second, that perception of SG as a technological solution, especially its appeal to conservatives, really does seem to be a key factor in fostering more bipartisan engagement. It just offers a different kind of conversation starter compared to regulations.
Right. But the discussion around SG often brings up the moral hazard idea, doesn't it? This concern that just knowing about a potential technological fix might make people less motivated to do the hard work of cutting emissions. What did this study find that adds to that debate? Especially if, as you said, familiarity led people away from the both option and more towards SG alone. Does that suggest this moral hazard could be a real practical concern for policymakers?
Yeah, it's a critical point, and the study definitely acknowledges that moral hazard concern. They note the evidence in the broader literature on this is actually pretty mixed. Some studies find it, others don't. What this specific research found was that familiarity made both liberals and conservatives less supportive of combining SG with emissions cuts, and more likely to back SG alone. That is a significant nuance, absolutely. It suggests increased awareness does shift policy preferences towards specific solutions. And yes, it definitely prompts policymakers to think hard about whether increased familiarity genuinely fosters informed consensus, or if it might, in some cases, just redirect existing ideological leanings into new policy preferences without necessarily addressing the core need for emissions cuts. It's a challenge ensuring that communication leads to a holistic understanding, not just picking a preferred lane.
Definitely a lot to think about there. So stepping back for the final big picture view, what are the major implications of these results for climate policy overall and for this ongoing challenge of political polarization in the U.S.?
Well, looking at the broader context, remember the National Academies, NESM, actually recommends developing targeted SG research programs carefully, but doing the research. This study suggests that increasing public familiarity with SG, especially if it's done through transparent, science-based communication, could potentially help reduce opposition. It might facilitate more constructive policy discussions, maybe finding some common ground. It really points to the potential, perhaps, for some of these lesser-known climate interventions, especially those framed technologically, like SG, to maybe bridge some of those deep ideological divides that have historically just stalled U.S. climate policy. It represents maybe a rare opportunity to actually reduce polarization in the climate politics arena, which would be quite something.
So this deep dive has really shown us something quite unexpected, I think. While most Americans are still unfamiliar with solar geoengineering, just increasing that awareness seems to have this surprising effect. It can significantly reduce the political polarization around this emerging climate technology.
Exactly. It really highlights the potential for these lesser-known, technologically framed ideas to foster more bipartisan dialogue, even as, it definitely raises important questions about how these technologies are framed and whether that public familiarity truly leads to a deeper, consensus-driven understanding, or if it just kind of shifts existing biases onto new policy options. It's not a simple fix.
Right. So what does this all mean for you listening in? Given that increased awareness seems to change perceptions, change concerns across the political spectrum, how might we as a society think about informing the public about these complex emerging technologies, especially if the goal is to foster more unified action on huge challenges like climate change? What conversations does this research spark for you?